When it comes to urban mass transit, it's hard to beat an underground railway, or subway, if you will. Fast, frequent, non-polluting and discreet, what could be better? Well, how about this? This is the Great Eastern Railway's Class A55, better known among rail enthusiasts as the Decapod. This was an engine built in 1903 to compete directly with the up-and-coming London Underground network. Some call it an experiment. Some call it a scam. Let's have a bit of context. The Decapod was built by the Great Eastern Railway. The Great Eastern Railway operated commuter trains out of Liverpool Street, serving East London, Essex and Hertfordshire. As a condition of getting parliamentary approval for their suburban lines, they had to offer cheap fares for workers, many of whom would be forced out of their homes by the construction of the new railways. Because of these cheap fares, the trains were hugely popular. The Great Eastern perfected the art of the rapid turnaround. A train would come in at Liverpool Street, the engine would be uncoupled, a new engine would be attached at the other end, and they were off again. There was at least one instance where the departing engine actually set off before they had had time to couple it to its train, and another where the train was pulled out before the incoming engine could be uncoupled. If those incidents sound familiar, it's because Reverend Audrey used them as the inspiration for stories in Thomas the Tank Engine. But the Great Eastern had hit a wall. The service was intensive, yes, but it couldn't get any more intensive. Trains were massively overcrowded, often carrying over twice the number of passengers they were designed for, and commuters even being packed into the guard's van. Tired workers would have to wait for several trains to pass before they could get a place. When trains were cancelled, it was utter chaos. The service was frustrating, uncomfortable, and unsafe. But the Great Eastern couldn't run any more trains, they just didn't have the capacity. The problem is that in many ways, a steam locomotive is not ideally suited for this kind of work. It's slow to accelerate, frequent stops put a terrible strain on the brakes and coupling rods. It needs to stop every so often for coal and water. It always has to be at the front of the train, hence the issue with coupling and uncoupling. In 1901, an alternative was proposed, by the name of the City and North East Suburban Electric Railway. This would have run from Monument up to Liverpool Street and Shoreditch, then headed up towards Waltham Abbey and Chequers Green. From Monument up to Hackney and Seven Sisters Road, it would have been underground. The scheme was very much favoured by the local authorities whose boroughs would have been served by it. Many of the boroughs it was to pass through were poor and overpopulated. A cheap and fast railway would allow workers to live further afield. The line was to serve new housing developments at Lordship Lane and White Hart Lane, built by the London County Council to empty out the slums. The land between Walthamstow and Waltham Abbey was also considered ripe for development. Local governments pushed for the railway to get parliamentary approval ASAP. "Hold on a second," said the Great Eastern, "let's not be hasty." They had reason to fear the proposed railway. The Great Eastern was not a wealthy company. Outside of London, their lines served the sparsely populated areas of East Anglia, where traffic was light. So they needed the suburban traffic, even if they couldn't handle it. They feared that the new railway, which was projected to run right into the very heart of London's financial district and to serve many areas where the Great Eastern had hitherto had a monopoly, would poach their passengers. Equally worrying was the fact that it was electric. These days, it's hard to express how much of an effect electrification could have on passengers. Electric transport, whether trains or trams, was phenomenally attractive to commuters compared to smoky, dirty steam trains. Electricity also offered the potential of a more frequent service than the Great Eastern could currently provide. The obvious response was for the Great Eastern to electrify their lines. But that was expensive, and remember, they had no money. So they came up with an idea. To build a steam engine that could accelerate as fast as an electric train, demonstrating that there was no need for this new underground line. Their locomotive superintendent, James Holden, assigned the task to Frederick Russell, his head draftsman. Russell was a smart chap who figured out that for this engine to work he'd need something quite unlike anything seen on the railways to date. In 1903 he came up with the Decapod. Well, it's different. Alright, a quick anatomy lesson. As you can see, the engine has 10 wheels, hence the name. To use the white notation, it's what we would call an O10O. No unpowered wheels in front, no unpowered wheels behind, 10 powered wheels in the middle. All the weight is on the driving wheels for maximum traction. And there was a lot of weight. The engine was fitted with an unusually large high-pressure boiler and a wide American-style firebox to ensure sufficient steam. It was also fitted with no fewer than 6 safety valves. High-pressure boilers come with a higher risk of boiler explosions. For extra power, the engine was driven by 3 cylinders instead of the usual 2. In order to get around curves, the central set of wheels had no flanges and the coupling rods were articulated. Innovative though the Decapod was, it was designed for one purpose: to demonstrate that a steam engine could accelerate a 300-ton train to 30 miles per hour in 30 seconds. Everything else was secondary. The engine was too long to negotiate the points at Liverpool Street, too heavy for most bridges, and didn't have enough coal and water capacity for the journeys it was theoretically built for. Nevertheless, on tests between Stratford and Romford, it proved that it could indeed meet the conditions required. Subsequent researchers have suggested that the results were perhaps a little too perfect. Either the Decapod was uncommonly lucky, or the testing was fiddled. The quoted weight of the locomotive appears to have been something in the region of 20 tons too light. None of this mattered. The Great Eastern Railway won on technicalities. The City and North East Suburban Electric Railway was defeated, and the monopoly was maintained, at least for the time being. The Great Eastern did toy with the idea of putting the Decapod, or something like it, into full production. But in the end they decided it wasn't worth the cost of rebuilding the lines to accommodate them. After all, their railways were the only game in town, and likely to remain so. Unless someone built a network of low-priced electric trams that could undercut rail ticket prices and lead to the demise of many commuter lines in London, but what were the chances of that? As for the Decapod, it had served its purpose. After showing it off, the company put it into storage. In 1906 it was heavily rebuilt, from an impractical 10-wheeled passenger engine into an impractical 8-wheeled goods engine. After 7 years in service, it was eventually scrapped. Hello all, I hope you enjoyed this underhanded tale from the tube. If you did, then please do hit like and subscribe if you haven't already. I'd like to thank my donors on Ko-fi and Patreon as ever. You are the Decapod to my threatened commuter services. And I'll see you all again very soon, I hope, for another tale from the tube.